Thank you so much for your patience and very kindly waiting out in the street while we got all of this looking like this. It does not look like this during the day, so thank you again. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Cosi, but none of you are here to see me. I'm very thrilled to welcome Liv Albert to her first ever London event, so let's give her a bit of this. Woo! Thanks. So honestly, we're just going to dive into it. We're going to talk for a while and we'll break if anyone has any questions for her or if they sort of come up during the chat. It's going to be a very sort of free-flowing thing. Try not to heckle if you can avoid it. But yeah, so save your questions until the end and then we'll break up for some mingling. And if you have anything you want Liv to sign or anything like that, there'll be time for that after. And she's brought some beautiful tote bags.
Yeah, and stickers and pins. I'm going to try to get you guys to give me some money. But no pressure.
But no pressure at all. So let's just get into it. My first question is, who or what was Medusa? A really basic one, but I want a recap.
Do we think this audience needs me to
tell
the story?
I want it. Just give me a little bit.
Medusa's a... See, this is the problem, is that you asked such a basic question. I did read these over.
She okayed these, by the way, everyone. Yeah.
And then now I'm going to bother her about it. Well, I think we all know that Medusa is... I don't even know how to start with her because I have so many differing thoughts about what I want to call her, but I will just call her a creature, I suppose. We'll get into that later. Medusa to me is a creature from Greek mythology, and I say that because I stand by that she was born that way, and we'll get into it. And as I have also done on the podcast, which I'm just assuming everyone has listened to, but that alone is slightly weird for me to assume. There's just so many people here. But I think we go into the further questions because we're going to get into deeper.
Okay, so she's a creature.
She's a creature.
Is kind of where we're at. And snakes are involved somewhere.
Snakes are involved somewhere, but often so are wings and some snarling and kind of the ability to turn things to stone. But even that is depending on the source, just how strong that is in her story. I think we all know this idea of Medusa, but if you actually break down kind of what does and does not exist in the ancient sources, it becomes far more interesting and where I know your questions are going to get us.
Yeah. Well, the next one is talking about the evolution of Medusa in the classical text and in classical art. Are you happier with that one?
Yeah, this is what I needed because the issue is she's not just one thing. You can't just say one thing. So the earliest surviving sources for Medusa would be Hesiod, who was, if he was a real man, then he was an incredibly misogynist man who lived in 6th, 7th century Boeotia, if we believe that he was real. Just locked eyes with you. Oh my God, other people who know the mythology. This is why I'm not going to look at people. So Medusa in that form, she appears in 3 or 4 different lines and primarily just as this kind of, it's sort of this explanation for why Perseus, is okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. But Medusa is born in the Hesiod. Medusa is born to these 2 creature gods, Phorcys and Keto, both of whom are these really interesting, really primordial, really early and ancient sea gods, which says so much about Medusa and the Gorgons being born from them. And they were, in Hesiod specifically, they were always born as these kind of creatures. I think the word monster has this connotation that I don't love, but we will get into it. But just being that they were not meant to be human, they were not meant to be anthropomorphic, they weren't like the other divinities who were meant to expect them to look like humans. And I think that's important because it changes over time and becomes sort of a really different idea. But I mean, in these earliest sources, and to me, the sort of truest form of Medusa, the most ancient form, is she's just born this creature who lives at the edge of the world with her 2 sisters, and we know that she is mortal, but her sisters are not, and there's no reason ever given for that in the most ancient sources, which I also think is incredibly interesting. And what we know about her is that she, and this is the Hesiod quote in, I'm not sure which translation, but most of them use this phrasing, but that Poseidon lay with her, but he's not even called Poseidon in that, he's called the dark-haired one, and he lay with her, in a bed of soft flowers. And from that, all we really know is eventually down the line, she has his children, but those children aren't born until her head is removed from her body, and it becomes this really big question about like what was actually going into that. Now flash forward like 500, 600, 700 years? Looking at you, you should have the answer. 700 years, let's say, to Ovid, who's writing in the Roman period, and whose work, The Metamorphoses, kind of fundamentally changes how we see Medusa in a way that I think is interesting and kind of annoying. But what Ovid tells us about Medusa is that she was born beautiful. He doesn't say what that looks like. He does not clarify that she is human or otherwise. He says that she was born beautiful. And in this version, her experience with Poseidon is very explicitly assault. He really spells it out in that way, but it's assault that happens because, or rather, it happens in Athena's temple. Now, a lot of people will tell you that Medusa was a priestess of Athena because it happens in the temple. There's no evidence for that. And so it happens in the temple, and then because of that, we have this storyline where Athena punishes Medusa for that, and transforms her so that she then, or rather, her beautiful hair, her once beautiful hair is transformed into snakes. And then we get this idea that, again, which is pretty throughout, though not always so explicit, that her gaze will turn people to stone. And I think it's really interesting to compare these kind of like, and again, like we're talking at least 600 years in between these two sources. And it's really easy to forget that when we're talking about Greek mythology. We think of it as this like singular kind of thing. But as I love to say on the show, like there is more time between Hesiod and Ovid than there is between Shakespeare and now. So you can get just how much can change in a story and an adaptation of a story, retelling of a story in that amount of time. And what it kind of ends up happening is that then we see this idea of Medusa as this, it's so hard. I don't like the idea that she then becomes this kind of monster who is therefore like bad and not beautiful. The Ovid stuff to me really complicates everything in a way where I think what's most interesting is to consider her as this being that is just born that way, and there's no punishment involved. She does still have this experience with Poseidon, which I read in the Hesiod as sexual assault as well, but it isn't explicit. And that's primarily because Hesiod isn't really explicit about like any kind of, not even just consent, but like women as human beings with agency. Like he doesn't really care about that. So there's a lot of people who would say like, oh, well then it was consensual. And you're like, on what planet is just like women being like these creatures in a story who have no like say in anything? Does that automatically mean it was like just fine and loving? But meanwhile, it's like this idea of like this the dark-haired god of the sea, who is also, as a god of the sea, he's inherently violent. And now I'm just rambling about all of this, but I think it still answers your question.
It'll definitely answers my question.
Right. This is what I do. But to me, it like screams of this violent encounter because this is a god of the sea. The sea is inherently violent. They knew that from day one, just as we know it now. The sea is a really scary place. And so the god of something that's scary is typically can be read as this violent god. Not to mention that like most other encounters we have with him and any mortal or divinity are non-consensual when they are explicit. So to me, it's this idea that she still has this experience and she's just a survivor of it broadly, and it does end up resulting in these children, which I know we'll get back to, Pegasus and Chrysaor. But I find it to be, I'm like jumping ahead of myself so completely, but I find it to be just way more impactful to consider Medusa as this creature that always looked like that and didn't have this kind of like ugliness inflicted on her by a goddess. I could keep talking, but I think we'll go to another question. It'll keep me talking.
Let me redirect you slightly.
Great.
Something that I've always been really curious about is, and kind of if we go back to the archaic period and we think about the imagery of the Gorgon and the way that it functioned, like in art and architecture. So the Gorgon, the head of a Gorgon, is it gorgoneia?
Gorgoneia.
That, yeah. What you said.
Gorgoneia is plural, but.
Those. And they serve this like fascinating apotropaic function for the Greeks. And then how do you reconcile the idea of her as this fearsome monster with the fact that the faces of Gorgons were used as a protective sort of mechanism for the Greeks?
Thank you. You guided me directly into the question I wanted, which is that I think that that's kind of the point, and that's why I find the alternate readings of her that we get from Ovid to be really disappointing, because the Gorgons are this apotropaic device, like they are this protective kind of talisman. They appear everywhere, but what's really interesting is they're often on armor, like they're, the specific gorgoneia is on Athena's, either her aegis or her shield, either of which are these protective devices. But then these individual gorgoneia appear in so many different places, but really often on armor and on shields and things, and that's both in like actual artifacts that exist. Like I went to the British Museum for the first time, and they have this like bronze like calf, and it has armor on it, and there's a Gorgon on the knee. But even in like the Iliad, you find lots of instances of these gorgoneia appearing on individual people's shields and things. So they're really used as this protective device. And to me, that just completely aligns with this story of Medusa as a creature who could defend herself. And that's what I find to be most kind of impactful about her, is that she defends herself against Perseus, certainly, or, obviously he takes her head, but then uses it as defense in that same kind of way. And we now consider this idea of it being this fearsome thing that she was, that I guess that her, when she was living, she was turning all these people to stone as some, actual, like, intentional harm inflicted on people. That's kind of how we're led to read it, rather than this protective aspect. Like, she is a defensive mechanism to me rather than offensive, because she is a shield. She is, she's kind of like, she's like a reflection, right? She's like, an enemy is coming at you, and the Gorgon is what kind of stops it. And so to me, that completely fits with this original idea of her being this creature who was living at the ends of the earth. She was not encountering people. She was not harming anyone or really doing anything, just kind of protecting herself and her sisters. And then when her head is taken, it serves the same purpose in a obviously kind of dark and unfortunate way. But to me, that makes so much more sense than this Ovid idea of it sort of being a punishment. Because I think that they do just serve this explicitly like defensive position. And I probably will get deeper into this, but I read it more as this idea that we think we're supposed to be afraid of them. I think that's just men being afraid of creatures that they couldn't have sex with, to be perfectly frank. Like, I think that's how Medusa ended up becoming what she is this she's a fearsome creature, when really what she was a creature that nobody wanted to bang, which is dark and horrible, but I think so much more interesting than this idea that she had to be like transformed in order to like protect her, or as punishment for something a man did. Like, I would much rather believe this idea that she was just this creature who, Percy is a specific instance, like clearly he doesn't want to go have sex with her, but I think that she represents that idea. She represents the idea of a woman who is capable of saying no, and then that gets turned on its head by the patriarchy, surprise, into being this thing that we're supposed to be afraid of, that she's dangerous, she's going to hurt you. And it's like, no, she's only going to hurt you if you come at her. She's only going to hurt you if you are the attacker. That was kind of an answer to your question.
That was definitely an answer, because it just got me thinking about, exactly what you were saying. There's something about the act of beheading her and ending her life that means that she can then be repurposed once she's like fully objectified and dead. But onto what you were saying about whether or not, was it women who don't want to have sex with men?
Yeah.
Well,
or capable of saying no in some way.
On that note, we have to talk about Athena.
Yeah.
We have to talk about Athena. So I want to know what you think about the particular version that has Athena transforming her from a beautiful woman into the snake-haired Gorgon, and the fact that it's Athena.
Well, Athena is an agent of the patriarchy.
Yeah.
We're allowed to love her for what she represents. I love that there is a goddess like her. I love that. Like, I do love Athena. People have been mad at me before, which is why I say that. Like, just because I complain about the actions of some of the gods doesn't mean I don't respect them. Getting defensive. No, I mean, Athena serves this really explicit role in so many myths, which is that she is quite literally this agent of the patriarchy. She is the hero's favorite goddess. She is her father's favorite goddess. She is, you know, we've Zeus turns her birth story into something where he did it alone, when in fact he ate her mother and then gave birth to her because of that. But we get this idea that he was like, parthenogenesis, like created her out of nothing or just out of himself, which is of course nonsense, and even the Greeks could figure out that was nonsense, but then they still found a way to be like, no, this goddess came from a man and there was no women involved. And I think that really shows in how she behaves in a lot of places, but specifically, like, it's Ovid who does this rewrite of her. And one thing people also love to forget is that Ovid, one, was not a Greek, and two, was not writing Greek mythology to be like he was not writing Greek mythology. Mythology is something that is developed culturally, and specifically that developed from this like oral storytelling tradition that I talk about way too often, and becomes this kind of cultural like knowledge. Whereas Ovid is coming in, and again, he's taking a 700-year-old story and he is writing it into something completely different. He's writing it into a series of stories about metamorphosis, about transformation. And so inherently, in order to use Medusa's story, he has to give it a transformation story, which it does not inherently have, which is why we get this idea that she is transformed into the creature that we know her as from the earliest sources. And so it just makes sense that Athena would be the one to do that. I don't really necessarily think that it fits. I do think it fits with the Greek idea, but less than in this version that Ovid gives us. Like, to me, that is like a really specific kind of a rewrite, which is also Minerva, we should say, right? Because it is Ovid. Yeah. And Minerva, for all that, like, the base level, and probably even my own book of Greek mythology, you can correct it if you buy it, but all these kind of like simple to the point Greek mythology books or websites or anything will tell you that like Minerva is the Roman name for Athena, but that's not really true. Minerva is the Roman goddess who best aligns with the Greek Athena. There are things that go into Minerva which were likely inspired by or which align with Athena, but she isn't Athena. She's much less of a warrior goddess, and she's much more of like a woman's goddess and a like craftswoman, which is really interesting, but it also fundamentally like changes her from the Athena of Greek mythology. So I think it's important, and I think it does fit her, but all the same, like, it is really important that story is not from a Greek source. And maybe one day, somebody's going to dig something up and it's going to be in a Greek source and we're all going to have to change our minds. But for the most part, it doesn't really fit with the Greek idea. And so to me, it just becomes this one really Roman. I mean, Ovid was also writing when Augustus was coming in, and he was pulling a Mark Zuckerberg and just like putting all of these morality laws onto Rome and ruining everything. It's quite literal. Like, Mark Zuckerberg has styled his own terrible haircut after Augustus. He is a dweeb of the worst kind. But he was putting all these morality laws. He was instilling this like really new kind of world in Rome. I won't pretend like I know a ton about Rome, but that part is pretty true. And so it says a lot that we have this goddess who is coming in and explicitly punishing a woman for getting assaulted by a god. To me, it's so Roman that, I mean, that does answer, I think, the point. But if you have more.
I just have a quick one.
Yeah, please.
Is it Athena or Minerva who helps Perseus kill her?
It is Athena, because I think, it's Athena, it is Athena, but Athena helps all the heroes, so It doesn't really stand out. I mean, it does because that's a good point to bring up, because also the killing of Medusa is really unique. People, and again, like this kind of, a lot of these kinds of, just the introductory mythology stories, and again, I'm sure I'm guilty of that, I'm not trying to pretend, I'm just better at it now, but these stories often present Medusa as like just another story of a hero defeating a monster, right? In the same vein as Heracles and the Nemean lion, or the Hydra, or, you know, even Theseus and the Minotaur. But Medusa does not actually fit any of those same kinds of ideals. Like, she is a monster, but there is no point at which we believe that she is harming anyone or that it is beneficial to anyone except Perseus, by extension Polydectes. Like, the story goes that, you know, Perseus and his mother Danae land. There's a lot of drama before this, including a shower of gold. But they eventually land on the island of Seriphos, and there's some drama. The king, Polydectes, wants to marry Danae. Perseus doesn't want this. She is his property as his mother, and he doesn't want to do that. And you know, I'm going to forget some of the details, but essentially Polydectes just wants Perseus dead so that he can marry Danae. And so when there's like another wedding and people are giving gifts, and so Perseus is like, oh, I'll appease this king, like, what do you want as this gift for like another person's wedding? It's a whole thing. And Polydectes is like, oh, don't give me a horse like everyone else is giving me. Go get me the head of a Gorgon. And that's the only reason that we have for why Perseus goes to kill Medusa. And so it's, you know, it's nothing like these stories of a monster terrorizing the lands, despite what misogynists on the internet will tell you and have told me in Twitter. But it's nothing about, she's not terrorizing anyone. There's no evidence that she hurt anyone or that she had done any damage. She just happened to be a Gorgon who could be killed. The only reason she's picked over her sisters is because she functionally can be killed. And so we get these retellings very often by men who get this idea that, like, she's just another monster on this long list of, like, the heroic deeds of dudes. But in fact, the entirety of it is just for another man's just trying to get Perseus killed. Polydectes figures that this will kill him, and then that's it. He doesn't want Medusa for anything other than to get Perseus out of the way. And so I think it's really interesting that, like, Athena does help to, because I remembered where your question came from, and even when my brain did the whole thing. But Athena does help along this, but she's helping him on this, like, heroic quest. The quest is not necessarily to kill the monster. The quest is to do the thing he needs to do in order to save his mother and, like, you know, fix things on the island. Medusa's death is unfortunately incidental, and so I think it's still quite different from Ovid. To me, Athena in that respect functions just in the way that she does for Odysseus. Or, I mean, I'm going to blank on every other time, but she's helped a lot of heroes do a lot of dumb stuff. And so to me, it's less of that, like, woman on woman. It's less, she's not necessarily, like, committing any kind of violence. She's just helping a hero, which is just sort of what she does as, again, the agent of the patriarchy. But in this really different way from Ovid, which is, like, so gross and just generally terrible.
Gross and terrible.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned some other monsters, and this takes me to my next question, which is all about feminine monstrosity, which I think you and I have spoken about for 4 hours previously.
Yeah.
So
may or may not have been recorded. I don't even remember.
I honestly, whether it was an episode or not, I don't know. But that list you just rattled off, none of them were the kind of feminized monsters that we have in Greek mythology. So we have, for example, Scylla, who you know I love, and the Sphinx, who are both these feminized monsters who eat men. They are very specifically devouring. And then we have Medusa, who's so different from that. So I just wanted to know what you thought about the kind of man-eating feminine monster in comparison to Medusa, who, exactly as you said, like, doesn't really do much to anyone else. She's just chilling in her cave by most.
There.
Yeah.
Yeah. I honestly think for the most part that it is a fairly modern invention to consider her a monster like all of those others. I don't think that there is much evidence in textual or like artifact, like material sources or surviving things, very poorly phrased, but you get what I mean. But, like, you know, I don't think that there's much evidence in the sources or all of the gorgoneia that survive in hundreds and like there's thousands of gorgoneia that survive. And I don't think that there's any evidence that that she did serve as that kind of monster. Like, there's a handful of pottery where he's killing her, but at the same time, she's pretty sympathetic in most of those.
She's asleep in some of them.
Typically, she's
with her
in the
eyes
story,
closed.
she's asleep. And even, like, you know, in the earliest surviving pieces, we don't even have this idea that he used, like, the shield as the reflection to do it. Like, that comes later, too. Like, he just snuck up on a woman and killed her in her sleep. And then her sisters realized and chased him out of there. Like, it is simply a heartbreaking story. And that's where, again, I think we get to this idea of women who were capable of saying no in whatever way. And, like, whether or not it was, like, a physical word or, like, actual her saying anything, or it was just the sheer nature of looking at her would turn you to stone. That meant she could say no. That meant she could defend herself against a predatory man in whatever way that came about. And I do think that in a lot of ways, like, all of that is true, and simultaneously, I do think that she does fit in some ways with Scylla and Charybdis, and I will, because you said it that way, I'm going to remind everyone that I have an episode with Cosi that, because of you, we named it, I forget what the beginning is, but definitely there is a line in the episode title that is Charybdis, the gaping hungry hole.
I'm not commenting on that at this time.
She definitely didn't give me that, or remind me that essentially Scylla and Charybdis is Odysseus passing between a bitch and a hungry hole. Yeah. Because Scylla is like a dog woman. Like, it's amazing. It's
Blame
just,
Homer,
like,
just to
honestly,
be super
the misogyny
clear.
is like oozing out of this story. And which is why I do think that they still have a lot in common with Medusa, in the way that I think that overall, in varied ways, I think all of those particularly feminized monsters, I think they still represent women that men couldn't have sex with. Because you know, they're a different level of it, and they're very Homeric in that way, where I think it's a little bit less. I think in the Odyssey it's a little bit less obvious, but then the use of them later becomes like way more obviously kind of feminized and scary, and it becomes more of like the point rather than in the Odyssey they're just kind of like that wild moment, and they're great. I mean, they're long time my favorite.
They show up briefly, but
yeah. But I do think that overall, like, over the general progression of mythology, they do represent kind of that same thing, where just these women that could say no and therefore were monsterized, were turned into these, like, really scary things that men should stay away from, because it's really scary when you don't get what you want, when you're in a world where everything is you get what you want. Like, women are property, and so this idea that women who could live on their own, like Medusa and her sisters, and who could stand up for themselves and defend themselves, like, that is a scary thing. That is a threat to the patriarchy in a really real way. And this is all stuff that I figured out kind of writing. I wrote a very long introduction to a book of short stories about Medusa, and it sort of broke my brain, literally and figuratively, but it's so interesting to kind of break that down, and I almost went into a whole rabbit hole of, like, even looking at, like, the word nymph and what we think of as nymphs now, whereas nymph just meant, like, girl in a way, like, not like Corey, but it's like another word for just girl. And then we get nymphomania.
Yeah.
And you get this idea that the nymphs are like, which, for one, nymph, now we say nymph for all of them, like, you know.
just like a coverall.
Yeah. But that word didn't really apply to who we think of as nymphs now. It, like, there was all the individual ones, right? There was, like, the oceanids and the, I'm going to forget literally all of the other ones. You know, there's the tree nymphs, there's the different types of water nymphs, all of this. But they didn't use the word nymph in that way. They each had their own name for all of them. And then we get all these stories where the gods are sleeping with all of these, like, minor divinities, these women, and they get away with it. And then down the line, we, as people, turn the word that just originally meant, like, girl into this, like, sex pot idea, and then you get nymphomaniac, and it's like, it's all coming from this really dark place. I couldn't get that into the book, but I did.
But you're getting it out now for everyone.
Like, I just think there's so much darkness that you can kind of pull out of that type of stuff, and it's sort of like, once you start seeing it, it's like, oh god, this is also terrible, but interesting. But yeah, so the monstrosity of it all, like, I just think that that's what so many of these women become in these stories, but also, like, again, I don't necessarily think that they were so monstrous back then. Like, the word monster didn't I mean, one, there's not like regularly even using the Greek for monster, I don't think, to describe them. That's very modern, how we would do it. Like, they're just a Gorgon. They are a divine creature in the same way that, you know, a Minotaur is a divine creature, but it is we think of it as a monster because he was killing people, but even still, I mean, we could debate the
Was it
Minotaur
his
being
fault?
a monster.
He was starved in the labyrinth.
Exactly. But we, you know, today have this idea that the heroes did good things, that the heroes defeated monsters, when in the ancient sources and in the general, like, mythology of ancient Greece, the heroes were doing a lot of things, but no one was expected to believe that they were good, that they were morally right. You know, that wasn't the point, and I think that ends up getting lost in how we end up seeing them, and then you turn these creatures, or the Gorgons, into these, like, terrifying monsters because you have to have Perseus a good guy. He can't just go kill a woman while she's sleeping with her sisters. That's not a good look. And so we get these ideas of this monstrosity, and it's why the Ovid version bums me out so much, but specifically why, and I'm sure a lot of you, if not all of you, have seen these, but every once in a while it goes around this idea that Athena wasn't even punishing her.
This was my next question.
Great, well, I'm getting right into it.
Get stuck in.
We get this idea that Athena wasn't punishing Medusa as it is explicit in Ovid, but that she was, like, saving her from future assaults by making her unappealing to men. And to me, that is the biggest ick. Like, imagine thinking that, I mean, it's like, what was she wearing, right? It's like, well, how short was her skirt? When in fact, it's like, this man came up to her while she was sleeping. and like, but Ovid makes it this idea that Athena, you know, or, sorry, now I'm jumping around, muddling myself, but this idea that this rereading of Athena as some kind of savior of a woman because she made her unappealing to men so that she wouldn't be assaulted again, like, to me, it's a far less kind reading of Medusa's story, and it is far more kind and truthful to the more ancient, the actual Greek sources, to say that Medusa was born a Gorgon. Gorgons might be monsters, but we weren't necessarily meant to be afraid of them unless you're the aggressor, because they are simply women who could defend themselves. And fundamentally, that's all that we do have in the ancient sources. These were female creatures who could defend themselves, but they were born looking like they look. And of course, there are countless different versions of, like, how we can picture a Gorgon. Some are weirder and scarier than others, but scary is subjective and monstrosity is subjective. And I think that when we think of them as, like, this gross, scary monster, you know, it has these misogynist undertones that I don't think people realize when they are, you know, Medusa has become this really feminist symbol, and I think that's good and powerful, but I just subscribe to the idea that she's a feminist symbol born that way, that she was born a Gorgon who could defend herself, who could say no, and obviously had a terrible fate because of that, but that's just who she was, rather than this idea of her becoming something icky to men. Yeah.
I always find the argument about Athena so difficult when you look at Arachne. Yeah. That immediately just stops me from buying into him.
And Arachne is the other place, if I recall, where Medusa is mentioned again. Oh. And I believe it's slightly different. Oh, now I wish I remembered what it was, but because Medusa appears twice in Metamorphoses, and so I believe the first one is in the Perseus' story, but then I think later she is mentioned again in Arachne's tapestry of these women who were wronged by the gods. And I don't even think, like, I mean, I think Ovid generally writes a lot of really interesting things about women, and so I don't even necessarily want, like, I'm not even, you know, saying that what he did was problematic. I think our reading of it is problematic, and when we consider Ovid as, like, a source for Greek mythology, that's what's problematic. Like, he was writing a retelling. He was writing a retelling like anyone does today, but it wasn't meant to be a fictional retelling. It was like Shakespeare doing, you know, one of his many, many king plays, where it's like you're writing about a real person, but, like, we don't believe that. I do have an English degree, but all of that is getting lost in my head. One of his king plays. We're not meant to believe. Oh, let's say Julius Caesar. That's a better one.
There we go.
One of his kings. There's just so many kings. And I'm in London is much funnier to say that here. But yeah, we don't believe that the Julius Caesar of Shakespeare was fully the Julius Caesar of history, and it's exactly the same thing between Ovid and the Greek myths broadly, not even Hesiod specifically, just Ovid. He's writing so much later. He's writing an adaptation, and that's interesting as a completely different thing. It's just not necessarily like an accurate reading of like what the Greeks considered to be Medusa.
Well, on the topic of classical reception, I wanted to ask you about this sculpture that went viral.
Oh, yeah.
Which flips the
I don't
role.
like it.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't even let you
Hold
finish.
on. Before, does anyone know the sculpture I'm talking about? I'm getting some nods. Okay, incredible. So it's this beautiful, very big, Liv hates it, but very big sculpture where you have a naked kind of humanoid Medusa with the snaky hair, and she's holding the severed head of Perseus. Why don't you like it?
I don't like it because I think that she is intentionally masculine, and it's done by a man.
Yeah. And the objectification, the fact that she's naked. I'm
Yeah.
like, is that strictly necessary?
I think that she is like, I mean, I don't want to say masculine in a way that's like derogatory. I think it's important that like, I mean, we all know my thoughts, it's fine. But I just think that like, I think that if it had been done by, I mean, I don't know. I just don't like it.
You would feel better if it was done by a woman? You'd be happier with it?
Well, and I think that at the absolute core of why I don't like it is that it doesn't look like anything from Greek, like from ancient Greece. It just looks like a woman with snake hair holding a man's head. And like, that's fine. But I don't think like as a feminist symbol, it's particularly interesting. And I also, and not least because it's done by a man, but that's maybe because I'm getting more and more misandrist every day.
Well, fair enough. But in the vein of reception specifically, that sculpture was done in 2008, but it actually went viral in 2018.
Yeah.
Do you know the meme I'm talking about? So someone reposted it and said, "Be grateful, all that we want is equality, that we don't want revenge or something." And it's just her holding the head, and that I'm like, and that was a tweet by a woman, and I'm like, okay.
And I do think I think that at the time it did make a real good point. I mean, it came out because of the Me Too movement, and I think it really did serve a purpose. So I think at that time and in that format, it made a really impactful point.
And being received sort of by women and for women.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I think that it's really a personal dislike too. Aesthetically, I don't like it. Like I'm not, that is the major part for me, is it doesn't look Greek at all.
Yeah, no, it definitely doesn't look Greek. So I've got a few more questions here, but I just wanted to have a little break and get a sense of how many questions there might be in the audience for Liv. Because if there's a lot, I can keep going. Okay, we've got one. Okay, maybe we'll take a few and then we can come back to this.
More too.
Okay, let me check the time. Yeah, we've got time. Correct. Pete, do you want to kick us off?
So you just made me think about something else. So the first thing is, Medusa, unlike maybe Scylla and Charybdis, seem kind of locked in their time. Medusa seems to be constantly evolving in our perception. And one thing that explains the Clash of the Titans, she's completely reinvented as this snaky warrior.
Yeah.
What do you think it is about Medusa that endures, that we can reinvent her? But also, with that statue just reminded me, I do have a replica of the Perseus statue. And it's depicted as he has just slaughtered a young woman. Her body is crumpled, and there's no monster there. He actually looks like a very proud murderer. So, I suppose the question is about what is that enduring thing that happens with Medusa that we feel like we own her in different ways.
Yeah.
Also the Versace logo.
Oh yeah, no, she's everywhere. Yeah. Versace crooks and castles. Not that I know anything about that brand.
I don't know what that is.
I mean, all I know is that it's a brand that uses Medusa, but it looks really similar to the Versace, which is also funny.
Interesting.
Like very similar. Yeah.
So the enduring power of her is a symbol that evolves over time.
So I think, and maybe this is going to become me as a broken record. I'm like, every once in a while, I'm just reminding myself that you all do listen to me, and this is not shocking to anyone, I hope, because I think I can sound like or slightly ridiculous otherwise. But I honestly think that the reason that Medusa endures in this way that no other monster does and evolves in such a way is that she has become a creature that men could imagine themselves having sex with. Like, I think that she's become this creature that became sexualized, and it's hard to track exactly when. There's like, in the ancient Greek surviving things, we have some a lot of the time, a Gorgon as this scary monster is just the head. And typically it's also not necessarily like labeled explicitly as Medusa. Like, contextually we know that the Gorgon head got placed in Athena's shield after Perseus killed her. But that story isn't necessarily as old as all the Gorgons that appear everywhere. We don't know which came first, the story or the Gorgon. And we do also have a lot of pottery, like you were saying, that where she is sleeping and he's sneaking up on her, like on tiptoes with a knife. And then there's others where, her crumpled body is lying and he's holding her head and her sisters are racing after, like screaming in horror. And so we get, like, in the ancient Greek world, I think that things like that were them grappling with a story that was already evolving. Like, my kind of theory is that the Gorgon as an image, kind of as a trope that visually came first. I like to think that it might have come from the Mesopotamian story of Gilgamesh, and there's this monster Humbaba that has really a lot of similarities in the iconography. And there's also this idea that Medusa, the story, comes from the West, comes from, like, where the sun sets. She lives on the edge of night, they say. And so she is from the West, but the iconography has a lot of tones that definitely look much more like they're coming from the East and from Anatolia, from Mesopotamia, ancient Iraq, all of that area, which we know that so much of Greek mythology was coming from those traditions and then evolving. And so my theory is that the image came first, the story came later to explain it. They had these gorgoneia that appear everywhere. Like, they are some of the most common, images that you can find from from ancient Greece broadly, but particularly like archaic period and things like that. So I think the story evolved to explain how a head ended up in a shield. And if we have this idea, I think it makes sense for why only one of the Gorgons is mortal. Like, why could only one of them be killed? Well, because a head had to end up in a shield. So one of them had to be killable so that could happen. That's only, or the question started out so differently. But I think that's where that's coming from. And I think that then that story evolved to be the story that we have. And then from there, we have all of these sort of slow, we have a lot of the Renaissance where they would humanize her in a lot of ways. Caravaggio's Medusa is like painful and beautiful and so
Bernini's
interesting. Bernini's marble, like,
beautiful.
Well, it'd be weird.
Where is it?
Yeah, well, it's here, but it's really awkward. Anyway, this like adaptation of Bernini's marble. Medusa.
Not safe for work.
It is enough. I think that there was a lot of that kind of happening. I think those artists from that time period kind of picked up on her. And then also, though, like, we get people like Freud coming in and they're like, all the snakes is genitalia, because to Freud, literally everything was genitalia. I had to read Freud's whole thing about Medusa for this book, and, like, it's quite literally that the absolute TLDR is that he believes that Medusa comes from when a young boy first sees female genitalia. And apparently, to Freud, the first thought is that the dick has been cut off. Like, there's no other thought, and therefore the fear is that you see Medusa and you fear your dick getting cut off. And it's utterly unhinged, but, like, that is...
2 + 2 = 60.
Honestly, this man, I don't... There's more, but that's what I can remember. But
we can have another event for you to slag off.
Oh my god. The bit I wrote about that made me real happy, because I think I just got to start a whole paragraph with, like, as someone who doesn't have a penis, I know I can't make a full, a judgment according to Freud, but I still think it's ridiculous. It sounded smarter than that, but it was funny. But no, I think that there's just so much going on where it's like we get this idea, then they're humanizing her in that sort of period with paintings and sculpture and things like that, and then I think I don't want to say that I could track any of that happening, but by the time Clash of the Titans comes along and we're dealing with this, we've got Freud who's come in and said everything's about dicks. And then we've got, all of this kind of humanizing of her. And we have so many people who have made her really pretty and feminine, even if it's just her head. And then, the Clash of the Titans comes in and makes her like a kind of a sexy monster, sort of, but she's also like half snake, which is explicitly not from mythology. That's echidna, if it's anyone. But I think that this now sounds like I don't have a great argument for it, but I still think that it all represents just this fear of women they can or can't have sex with in these varied ways. Or like if they want to, I think that there's a point where men decide they want to with Medusa, and then so they have to make her really scary because they've decided that they've sexualized this creature, but she could kill them, so then they have to make her like an enemy to be killed. I think there's a lot of layers, and I probably need more psychologists working with my head, but and Medusa, but probably mine.
I think we've got a few questions. Can't quite see who that is. Well, is that you, Sebastian?
It is me.
Okay, go. Go.
I was interested in what you were talking about with Medusa's gaze. I feel like there's something very, because we talk about the male gaze all the time, but it's the female gaze that is dangerous with Medusa. And you have Zeus who wears the aegis, and there's the gaze of the Gorgon is it's an offensive weapon to people. What is it about the female gaze that is so dangerous or powerful to the Greeks, do you think?
Well, I do. For one, I think it's defensive even still. Like I think she's always used as
a shield.
Yeah. Because it's always some form of defense. But the thing is, and this is where I think it's hard to kind of pick this stuff apart, because in the Greek sources, like in terms of text sources, we really don't have a lot about her transforming people to stone with her gaze. Like that really comes later. Like I think we're meant to understand that that's happening, but it's not a major story point in the Greek sources that survive pre-Roman period. And so I think what's kind of happening is that they're reckoning with the image that's there in all of these ways and trying to understand how that happens. And so I think, I want to say it's like so much about the power of the female gaze, but I really do think that what is going on is just like a number of things with the iconography that's kind of pre-existing and become this really important thing simultaneously with the story that they've then developed around it, and all of which kind of just drills down to, in order for this head on a shield to be defensive, like it does kind of have to have this power. And I think, it's like using the word petrified is kind of the perfect way. Like you're just supposed to be scared into sort of, what's the word I want? Basically, I think that it's more similar to animals in nature that have that as a defensive mechanism. The creatures that have, wish I had a good example of this, but there's so much in nature where they have like a false face on like a butterfly or something, or like there's so much of this kind of natural defensive nature in nature. That was terrible, but so many animals have kind of developed that type of thing, defensive means for themselves. And so to me, I think it's more akin to them, the Greeks, kind of understanding how certain animals could develop those kinds of functions and sort of applying it to a face. I don't know. I wish I had a smarter answer about the gaze, because obviously there's so much to do with the male gaze, but I also just think that men were the men who were kind of in that realm of what we now know from ancient Greece. Not to say that people weren't thinking about it back then, but in terms of what then survives for us today, I honestly don't think the men were giving the women enough credit to even like develop those stories. I would love to know like what women thought of Medusa and of the Gorgon and things like that, but yeah, I think I'll stop rambling now, but it's an interesting question.
I think we've got a few more questions. I can see a hand, but nothing else. Is that Elodie? Hello. Oh. We're going to lean around.
Question. So, because I know a lot less about ancient Greece, but was it used the same as the Romans? Because I always find it fascinating that it uses in so many doorways as to kind of protect the house from evil. Just thinking what you were saying about it being defensive. With the Romans, it is kind of explicitly defensive. Was it used the same in ancient Greece? I actually don't know.
Yes, but I think more so on on their body. So like on armor and shields. Yeah. And then they were like
and drinking
often,
cups.
What?
Drinking cups.
Yeah, lots of pottery,
Great
and
ones.
they're like a lot of what's the word? It's not acroteria, is it? Like the
Acroteria?
No, like the piece, like the little extra bits of on architecture. There's word for it.
Anyone? End bit?
Yeah, but like I think I've seen it on tiles. And
Yeah.
on the roof, but I can't think what they're called.
No, exactly. There's a word
If anyone
for it, but
remembers,
I've-
shout out
yeah.
unprompted, please.
The tip of your tongue too. Yeah. I literally have a tattoo of one of them, so I normally know.
Oh, I think
but
Martin's
not the
about to Google it.
Yeah. No.
End bit on thing.
Anyway, but I
Great.
do think it's interesting that the Romans then came along and like took it and sort of applied it more to their homes and things. Like I think they kind of got the same idea and then, as the Romans would often do, like made it work for their purposes. Yeah.
Well, it's weird to think about the face of the Gorgon at the bottom of the Kylix. So once you're already kind of pissed, she's like,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
Like, is she trying to protect you or freak you out?
Well, and I think
don't know.
that's kind of part of it too. Like
Yeah.
you're meant to be scared, but it's not meant to be like scary. Like it's that kind of idea of fear more as I don't know, this reaction. It's less about the fear
Like a
of,
psychological exercise.
Yeah, it's not like the imminent danger,
Right.
like other the monsters we might think of. Yeah.
Are there any more? Oh, yeah.
Hey, hello. So thinking about what you were saying about the Gorgons being unbannable, and specifically thinking about the
Sounds so much.
version.
Sorry, it's so different in the accent. It makes me feel way sillier for saying unbangable, but yeah. Keep going.
Specifically regarding like the Ovid, where she's a young woman and she turns into a monster. How much is that ageism and kind of aging out of being bannable?
Thank you. Because, so I think that there's something going on with the Ovid there as well. Yeah, definitely, because she is this like young, beautiful woman. But I think there's a lot to be said for the aging out as well. Maybe less so with the Gorgons, but I think it's a really important point because the initial step before Perseus gets to the Gorgons is he has to go to the Grei. The Grei are the ones who can tell him where the Gorgons are, and they are another like trio of divine women who have been demonized in this truly bizarre way. Like their name means the gray ones, and so modern interpretations will have you believe they're old hags. They like to use the word hags.
Are they the ones in Disney Hercules?
Yeah, well, Disney's Hercules conflates them with the faith.
Right, yeah.
Like visually,
Always
they're
confused me.
Visually they're the gray eye, but then with the with the eye and the sharing of a tooth, which fine is kind of gross, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're like these old ugly hags. But yeah, then they mix it with the fates, with the cutting of the Disney's Hercules is great, but not the point. Yeah, no, I do think there's a lot to be said there, and so whether or not like it can be directly correlated to the Gorgons is something, definitely when Ovid comes along and makes those weird kind of, the sort of young and beautiful bit feels like a real stretch. But the Grei being in line with the Gorgons, and they're born of the same gods, which is really interesting. They're also these like born of sea deities, but only live next to the sea, not in it. And they are so explicitly now seen as these like old and ugly, but again, it just means gray. Like there's actually other places in the sources where they're also like conflated with swans. They're like meant to be swan-like in some way. We don't really know how that is or what that would really look like to be like kind of swan women. But Aeschylus calls them that, and like I think at least one other source. But there's a lot to be said there as well when it comes to this like fear of an aging woman, an independent woman, like all of these women who appear in this story as these kind of like beings to overcome are all explicitly women who live alone without men.
And who can no longer produce children for them, right?
Well, or just
Is it
like
like a-
we're no longer like sort of appealing in the way of, but there's no like attempt to produce children, thankfully. But
With the monsters.
yeah, other than Medusa, which is of course a whole other sad mess. But it's an interesting question. Yeah, yeah. I've seen you a couple times. What?
Yes.
Yeah.
What links would you see between the story of Medusa and other related things that are related to Gorgons in ancient literature, like the Gorgons like wail or scream, or the Gorgon's blood?
Oh. Okay, well, the Gorgon blood I'm deeply obsessed with right now, but I don't have like a ton of I don't have like a fully formed thought on it. The Gorgon blood appears in one play, the Ion, and it's Euripides and it's magnificent. Surprise, surprise. But specifically, it's really interesting because it seems to be a different Gorgon. It seems to be like he doesn't connect it to the story of Perseus or the Medusa that we know. He says that this Gorgon was killed on the battlefield of the Gigantomachy. So on the Phlegraean fields in Italy, it's like when the gods fought the giants. Specifically just in this one bit of this one Euripides play, he says that a Gorgon was killed there and the blood was preserved, and it's something like there's sort of two different types of blood, and one like from one side of her body or the other, and one is healing and one is deadly. It's like a poison, and I think there's probably a lot going on in there, which aligns to the fact that Aristotle believed that menstrual blood was corrosive, something he could have easily tested, and so I think there's something going on there with this like fear of women and bleeding and like, but again, I think it's really interesting that it's so explicitly not Medusa and it's not the Gorgons that fit into any other surviving source. And I think it's a good example of like just the way that we don't know anything about Greek mythology. Like we think we do, but like we really like that's a huge question, and it doesn't really, it's just a reminder, I think, that we're talking about like 800 years of writing and all of these different regions that were not unified and they didn't have a unified language or anything. And then we are now trying to pick apart like what on earth they were thinking. And I think we never will fully understand, but it's really interesting to think about. But yeah, that's a very good question. I love the Gorgon blood. I'm like,
I was reading about that today. So cool.
It's so weird.
Cool.
And it's just
weird.
Euripides.
Of course it is.
And then the Ion is so specifically interesting too, because the Ion also is the only thing I've ever read from ancient Greece that treats sexual assault by a god as a traumatic experience that would result in PTSD. And that alone to me is like...
That's why Euripides is the best.
That's why Euripides is the best.
Yeah.
Look, I have a bag. They're for sale.
I think we've got one up the back.
Yeah.
So I thought the point that you just made about how we can never really know what they were actually thinking, I think that's really visible in Ovid, who is very sort of referential, and I don't think he's actually trying to come up with any kind of definitive source, and he makes reference in the text of things being something that's been handed down and being pieced together. But what he does take from Hesiod, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is the idea that when Medusa dies, Pegasus is born on her death.
Yes.
And that is something that the idea of women being, or the feminine being something that births, and also relating to the Gorgon blood, because I think it might come from her blood. How does this sort of idea, and also the fact that these creatures can no longer have children, but actually Medusa does give birth to something from her death. What do you think about that?
I think what do I think about it is the greatest part of the best way to phrase that question, because there's no like answers, but it is such an interesting thing, because yes, so Pegasus and a man named Chrysaor, who is like promptly forgotten in most mythology, doesn't really appear anywhere.
He's a giant with a golden sword?
Sometimes, but yeah, but also like it's just like a statement. And
Yeah.
when he's born, he's like a full afterthought. It's like, the flying horse Pegasus was born, and Chrysaor.
He was also there.
He was also there. But to me, that too, like, really connects back to what I think is coming from Hesiod, which is that the experience with Poseidon was violent. Like, the children are only birthed when her head is cut off from her body. Like, they fly, or Chrysaor doesn't fly, I don't know how he gets out of there, but Pegasus flies out of, like, the stump of her severed neck. There's even pottery where this tiny horse is, like, flying out of this poor woman's neck. Like, it's wild. And so I think that there's, I mean, I wish I had more, anything definitive to say on that, but I just think it's like further evidence to the nature of her story as this very, both like tragic but also really creative process, I guess. You know, she does have these children who, I mean, at least in the case of Pegasus, goes on to be pretty important. And just so the fact that they are born in that way, I think really emphasizes like the importance of her, but also this weird thing that happens with Poseidon, which I do want to call assault, but you know, it isn't. It's just sort of a, to me, that's more evidence that like obviously it was terrible. Like that, you know, they're the only births in Greek mythology that come out of that level of violence.
Dionysus.
Well, but even Dionysus is not
the same.
Not quite as bad.
No, not beheading.
No, it's not straight beheading, and it's like the idea with Dionysus is that he would have been born anyway, whereas with Medusa, it's pretty clear that it wouldn't have happened without her being beheaded.
Do you think there's anything maternal in it? I mean, I'm just thinking about Echidna as the mother of monsters, and to your point about the kind of generative, procreative power of women, even when they are monsters, even when they are dead, there's still this emphasis on not what can we get from them, but a little bit what can we get from them and their bodies.
Well, I think that there's probably something to be said for this being something like intentional by Poseidon, you know, because every time a god sleeps with a woman, no matter how it happens, a child is always produced. And, you know, like anything in myth, we don't have any kind of explanation for why that is or isn't, or sort of, you know, any kind of why. That would be cool. But I think there's something to be said for the fact that this is one instance where the birth happened. It's like they're torn from her, kind of, like in this really, I want to have like some insightful thing to say to it, but I think it's just, I mean, there's probably something deep in there, but it's just sort of generally terrible. But it says a lot, I think, about her power and her general creative power, the fact that she was sort of capable of this. But yeah, that's a great question, and I don't have a great answer.
Question. Oh, do you want to unpick? Yeah.
No. Sorry.
No, you go.
Okay, go ahead.
You could perhaps link it, sorry, it's just my thought, you could perhaps link it to your idea about the Gorgons as these, like, absolutely non-sexual, non-feminine beings, that it's only after she's been defeated that she could become the mother and fit into that more stereotypical role.
Yeah.
I like that.
That's really interesting. Yeah, because it's sort of this idea that they don't necessarily fit that like typical woman or matriarchal kind of, like, you know, women in ancient Greece tended to serve one purpose, and that was to make men. And so I think it is, that's really interesting to think about the ways that she sort of doesn't fit that role until she's sort of gone. Yeah, I like that. Thank you. Yeah.
Taking a mental note.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was thinking, like the whole the classical tie-ins of it all. If like maybe a TV series like Chaos were to actually do the myths more respectfully, how would you like them to show Medusa?
Oh, I think so. This is such a disappointing answer, but it's how I've decided or determined that this is always my answer about modern Medusa reception, which is that I don't want it. And that's a very personal decision. Like, I've found there's something in her story to me that I don't like the speculation, and again, that's personal. Like, I respect it. I'm glad that people are kind of playing with her story and creating new things from it. But I mean, for example, like, I was originally the Medusa piece that I wrote for is this book called Medusa, Old and New Greek Tales, something like that, and that's the one. Thank you. Does it say is New and Ancient?
New and Ancient Greek Tales.
Thank you. Yeah, that's the one. Great. They didn't end up getting them in that one, but they have the other books here, so everyone can take a look. It's pretty. It has red edges. It's gorgeous. I did see it for sale in the British Museum gift shop the other day, which was pretty big for me. So, you know, they have it there. But when I heard about that book for the first time, it was really interesting. I had like a handful of friends send me the call for submissions to be like, oh my God, Liv, like, you love Medusa. I'm sure you want to write a short story for her. And I immediately looked at it and I was like, no, I don't think I could fictionalize her. I don't think I could, because to me, the thing I want to do is pick apart everything about her that does exist from the ancient world, and I just want to, like, I don't know. I just want to tear it all to pieces and shove it in my brain in some way that'll make it more understandable. But in this way where I've just found, like, I don't like sort of the reimagining of her. So I would, like, welcome it to others, but I find I don't like to speculate, because in my head she just, like, is this she's too much of, like, one original thing. I'm going to end the story, which clearly, because that was an ADHD moment. To finish, I learned about that book and was like, no, I couldn't write a short story. And then the next day they emailed me asking if I wanted to write a 28,000 word introduction on her. And I was like, yes, I do. Yes. Yeah. So it went immediately from, like, oh, I couldn't fictionalize her, to, oh my God, they want to pay me to just dig into the actual ancient sources. So instead that's what I did. And I'm honestly so proud of that work. Because I really was able to kind of trace her from throughout all of the ancient Greek sources that we have and the ancient mythological, but also into, like, the weird ways in which she has been changed and used even in the ancient world. So there's one story that is in that book, and I think it's from Diodorus Siculus, I always forget, but it's a very late source. And actually, no, it couldn't have been him. Anyway, there was this handful of people in the sort of generally Roman period, but still very much ancient world, who really liked to rewrite famous myths from Greece and try to, like, understand the reality behind them. It's really interesting and bizarre. So somebody says that the story of Medusa and the Gorgons is not, you know, this fantastical tale as it appears in Hesiod, but instead it's this story of this very real race of warrior women who lived in ancient Libya, it says. And he says they were like the Amazons, you know, they were these really powerful warrior women, ruled by women, only queens, generally really impressive, and then goes on to say that the story of, you know, them dying and generally why we don't still have this race of warrior women is that when Heracles was going around, I forget what the phrasing is, but the idea is that, like, Heracles was going around and, like, basically inflicting, like, a male-dominated society on that world, and he found those women and then just killed them all because women couldn't rule. And it basically just, like, says that. And you're like, well, okay, great. Like, just a way to say the quiet part out loud, like, this idea of why we don't have those stories, or, you know, this person's like, well, it couldn't possibly be that these women were, you know, that powerful. It was just, no, Heracles just went along and killed them because he just needed to, or whatever it is. There's a lot of kind of these weird attempts to understand this, them in general. A lot of it ties to Libya, ancient Libya, so it's just generally kind of North Africa. But they also say that somebody says that when Perseus was flying over, because the Gorgons were meant to be on this edge of night, they're, like, the farthest west. You can kind of imagine that, like, the west of Africa that's the westest that they go in the ancient Greek world. And so they sort of lived generally there, and that when Perseus was flying over Africa with the severed head, her blood dripped and landed in Libya, and that's why Libya has so many snakes, they say. And so, you know, there's all of these really interesting and sort of odd attempts to understand this story and where she came from, but I don't know how I got onto that. You mentioned the book, but thank you, or showed me the book. This is ADHD / I can turn on this personality in front of all these people, but also so much social anxiety, so I'm just gonna ramble so much. Does anyone have any other questions?
I think we've got time for one more.
We're getting there.
You wanna go?
Hi, I was wondering, do you think Medusa had like a role in ancient Greek society? Like, do you think she was used to warn people that like this will happen if you, to warn women that if you don't produce children, you'll get punished for it? Or do you think it was someone that they could look up to or go to in times of need?
Okay, it's a great question. I love to think of what Medusa could have been to ancient women. I think in terms of what we know, I like to think more of a Gorgon specifically, not just Medusa, because I do think also the Gorgons were sort of the iconography that we have. I think, again, Medusa kind of ties back to this attempt to understand the iconography that already existed, and that's why we get this like singular one with a name. But I think that the Gorgons broadly, hopefully, were looked on by women as this kind of less so more I think that hopefully they were something that was more positive, where again we're looking at a woman who was able to defend herself and maybe was not, always appealing to men or whatever these things are. But I don't know. I wish I could speculate more. I'm too obsessed with like the ancient sources and what we do actually know or don't know. But I definitely want to believe that the Gorgons generally were something that brought kind of at least some kind of comfort to people. I mean, they were meant to be protective, so hopefully women also felt that applied to them and not just like the men with their armor.
Yeah. I think that's a great note to end it on. So thank you all of you for coming. Thank you to the Common Press for having us, and thank you to Liv Albert.